gospel reading comes from the book of Mark, chapter 12, verses 41 to 44. This is the story of the widow's offering. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you so much, Julie, for that beautiful piece. Bob, thank you, Lynn. That was gorgeous. We appreciate your gifts of music, and the gift that you bring to our worship service this morning. And I want to say thank you to Sheila and her good work in helping us pull this together. And Roberta and our readers will be with us as we do, like we normally do in a service. Our readers will be with us, and I'm so greatly appreciative of their willingness to help us in this time when we are, as the church, in need, and when we try to reach out and help the needs of others. So let's talk a little bit about the journey that we have been making through the season of Lent. And I'm just going to go back a little bit and remind us that the title of the sermon series is Stops Along the Way. We're following Jesus from where he begins his final journey to the cross, beginning with Galilee, moving through Jericho, then Bethany, which is just 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, the gates of Jerusalem, then Jerusalem itself. Our first Sunday of Lent, we started in Galilee. And the title of my message is What Was Hidden. It is where Jesus reveals to his apostles and the other disciples what's going to happen to him. What has been hidden would be revealed. And of course, they don't understand it at all. And literally, they're not going to understand this until they literally see Jesus as the risen Christ. But he is preparing them for what they are about to go through. And he's explaining to them in that, as we talked about that first Sunday, why he was doing this, to bring out that which was hidden, to let us know how much God loves us, that our God is a God of love. And that's what had been hidden for so many years in different religions and faiths and traditions, that God is a God of love. And then we went to Jericho, where Jesus healed 2 blind men who were sitting outside the gates. And we talked about that Sunday, how in that time, those who were sick, those who were ill, those who were poor, were segregated from the rest of society and were kind of left to their own means with no one to help them. Jesus invites them to be healed. While the 2 blind men are crying out, "Help us, Son of David being a title for the Messiah, which, of course, this is during the Passover. There are thousands of people on the road, and to proclaim someone as Messiah was a very dangerous thing to do. So Jesus is shushing, the crowd is shushing them. Be quiet, this could be very dangerous. And Jesus simply calls them forth and asks, "What do you want?" And they said, "We want to see." And he heals them at that moment, and then they follow him as they continue their journey heading toward the gates of Jerusalem. Now imagine they went with him through the gates of Jerusalem, praising him as the Messiah. And then last week we came to our 3rd stop along the way, Bethany. Bethany is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, where Mary anointed Jesus' feet with this very, very costly perfume or oil called nard. In fact, it was a perfume traditionally used, an oil traditionally used to anoint those who were dead. In the days of, after the death of someone, the 3 days of preparation for the service, they would anoint the body with this nard. It was a family heirloom. And Mary, in appreciation and joy for the fact that Jesus had just raised her brother Lazarus from the dead, takes that extremely expensive family heirloom and pours it upon Jesus' feet and anoints him, and then wipes it dry with her hair. Judas, looking on, is offended by this and says, why was that not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? And Jesus replies and very strongly to Judas, saying, leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but me I will not always be with you. And so again, we see the point where Jesus is connecting that act with what is going to happen to him on the cross. And the fact that when he does arise again, and before he ascends, what does he say to us and to the world? I will always be with you. So in that message, in that story, we see the transition from the idea that Jesus was going to leave them because of death to the idea that after his death and resurrection, he would always be with them and always be with us. And so now we come to our fourth Sunday of Lent message, which is called Jerusalem, the Treasury of the Temple. And this is where we are going to start today. Now, before we get into the message itself, I want to tell you a little bit what has happened before this event takes place in the treasury of the temple. Because again, we want to kind of stick with the movements that Jesus is making as he heads toward the cross. First, he went through, after Bethany, he went through the gates of Jerusalem. Palm Sunday, what we celebrate as Palm Sunday, where the crowd declared him to be the Messiah, which again put him at great risk and danger, and immediately encouraged or fomented the Passover plot that to arrest Jesus. And of course, Jesus had already rebuked Judas, as we had seen, and Judas becomes a part of the conspiracy. So we see him going through the gates. And then in the Gospel of Mark, and in the other Gospels as well, we see Jesus cleanse the outer court of the Gentiles. That's one of the first things he did. He went into that court, which was the courtyard of the temple. It was the furthest boundary of the temple. It was the only place where Gentiles were allowed. And if you recall the story, it was where sacrificial animals were sold at a kind of what you would say is an exploitive rate. In fact, we kind of see that happening now, don't we? We get very angry when we see people raising the cost of things in order to take advantage of what we're going through right now with COVID-19, with the fact that the shelves are empty, the fact that some things that we are used to having and buying very readily are not there. And we become very angry. Well, that was what happened in that temple courtyard. The sellers would take advantage of the people who had come from all over the empire to make a sacrifice, to offer a sacrifice in the temple. They raised the prices of the sacrificial animals that one had to buy in order for the priest to take it in and make the sacrifice. So you can imagine, it kind of helps us to understand a little better, doesn't it, why Jesus cleansed the temple. But it was also, he cast out the money lenders and the money changers, but it was also an act of the Messiah. The Messiah was expected to come to Jerusalem and make things right for the people of God. And so it was an act of the Messiah when he did this. So he has just done this at the court of the Gentiles. Now we see him move a little closer to the center of the temple, the next courtyard, which is the courtyard of the women. And it is in this courtyard where this story from Mark takes place. Just a reminder that the courtyards that led into the temple were the court of the Gentiles. The Gentiles were forbidden from going further. The court of the women were forbidden from going further than that. The court of the Israelites, which was the court of the men, the righteous men of the people of God, only they were allowed in there. The women were forbidden from moving further from that. The court of the priest, where only the priest could go in. And then finally the temple, the inside of the temple itself, where the high priest would go in, where the Holy of Holies was, and where the central altar was. So again, remember, this is the time of Passover. And it's interesting that as we look at the geography of the temple, we see, again, that stratification, that segregation between different groups in Israel's religion. And Jesus had come to break down all of those boundaries. And we see him do that. And the final boundary, of course, the boundary between death and eternal life. So now we come to this story, which takes place in the courtyard of the women. It's the story of the widow who gives her 2 mites and places them as a gift to the temple, and how Jesus reacted to that, what he saw in that. If we think about it, I just mentioned before what's going on in terms of those who are price gouging. And obviously price gouging has been going on a long time in human culture, hasn't it? We know that crises bring out the best and the worst in humanity, don't they? I mean, they just do. There is calm assurance, and then there's panic. There are those who share what they have with everyone, and we are amazed at their generosity. And then there are those that hoard everything, and we are amazed and appalled by their selfishness. In the midst of crisis, for everyone who takes care to protect the community, who does the things that we are being asked to do, whether it's social distancing or washing our hands or not moving around too much or not being in crowds, for every one of those, we know there are plenty of others that simply cannot be bothered with it. They just decide, we're not going to worry about it. And of course, what happens is they become vectors for the disease, for the virus, and it spreads further. And we're seeing that now. I promise you, ministers are going to have sermon material for decades to come out of what we're watching right now. It's just amazing. But it brings us back to the very essence of human nature. What we are like, the good and the bad. The story of the widow's sacrifice highlights one of the great divides in human culture. There's so many. But the great divide between the rich and the poor in first century Palestine. Now, the story is not all about that. Jesus told lots of stories about that divide between the rich and the poor, but this really isn't one of those. Although often it's mistaken or misunderstood to be that's what it's about. It's really not about that. And we're seeing so many divisions in the midst of this pandemic. So many divisions, stark examples of the many divisions, including the division between those who have great material wealth and those who don't. And doesn't have to look far to see that, do we? How about those who are receiving testing for the virus on demand and getting the result the next day? And those who are, because they have the resources or they have the power or they know somebody, getting all the equipment that they need to survive, whatever it is. And then those, many, unfortunately many, in our healthcare centers and in our hospitals and in the ICUs who do not have the equipment that they need. There's that divide once again. And then we see those who are able to flee into their redoubts, into their shelters. Those who, probably the wealthiest among us, were able to get on a plane and head out of the country or head to wherever they feel it's safe and be there until this all happens. And then we look at our folks who are out on the streets, right here in Tucson. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. There's that great divide once again. I even read about, a couple of days ago, about some of the most wealthy and powerful literally being in airplanes riding around the whole time in their jets, which is a little tight quarters for me. So, but yet that's the kind of thing that I don't know if that's true or not. You hear a lot of rumors during times like this, but that's what I read was happening. Just as such examples of injustice anger us, and rightly so, they also angered Christ, as we see time and time again in his actions and in his teachings. The story of the widow's coins is one of the most abused stories in the history of our faith. And unfortunately, in the history of Christianity, it has been used to abuse other Christians. Sadly so. Because that's not what the story is about at all. What appears to be the message of the story is that of the widow giving all of her wealth is that that's what we have to do. That in order to be good Christians, we have to give up everything that we've got. Everything that we've got. And unfortunately, unscrupulous church leaders have used that very story, this story, to tell people that if they just have enough faith and do this or do that, everything will work out for them fine, which is a real perversion of the idea of faith to begin with. So again, and normally we associate this story with stewardship. It's been just a classic story from the Bible to be used as an anchor for stewardship sermons. But it's not about stewardship. It's much more than stewardship. It's about something much deeper than that. Stewardship is an important principle in Christian life and in sustaining the work of the church. But this is about something much deeper than that. This story is not about what the widow does. It is about what Christ is going to do in the next few days. It's about the sacrifice that he is going to make, and he uses the example of the widow's sacrifice to prepare his followers and for his followers to understand what is going to happen. I already mentioned about the different segments, the segregations within the temple itself, the different geographical venues of each one. This story takes place in the treasury of the temple. Now, the treasury of the temple was located in the court of the women. So in the court of the Gentiles, you had where they sold where the price gouging was, where they sold the sacrificial animals. And now, in the court of the women, you had the treasury of the temple. The treasury. Now, what was the treasury? Well, it was 7 large horn-shaped receptacles that were mounted against a wall. And during festivals, attendants would stand by these 7 horns, and whenever someone gave a particularly large offering, they would make a great proclamation. An instrument might have even sounded a note or something like that. But people would simply come up before they went to their appropriate place within the temple precincts. They would come and they would make the offering. Now, this was during Passover. In Mark, this takes place at Passover. And we know that Passover was the greatest of all the religious festivals in Jerusalem's temple, which meant you had thousands of believers coming from all over the Roman Empire to celebrate together the Passover, and that meant that you had people who had brought special collections for the temple. And they would come in carrying bags of wealth that they had collected, and they would pour them in. And Mark notes that the wealthy are making a very special point of pouring their wealth into these horns. And as I said, when they did that, it was celebrated. And it's interesting that we see Jesus just as an observer here. He is sitting and he's watching all these people pour in to this segment, this section, and go up and pour their treasure into these large horn-shaped receptacles. And it's quite a scene, as you can imagine. Then he notices a poor widow who anonymously and without fanfare placed 2 small copper coins, which Mark tells us is the equivalent of a penny, into one of the receptacles. Now, we know nothing about this widow. We do not know her name. We do not know her situation, but more than likely, she probably actually lived in the precincts outside of the temple, because there was housing supported by the temple fund, by the temple itself, and by the priest. There was housing for widows and for orphaned children. And it was particularly for widows who were had no family, who were totally dependent upon the treasury of the temple. And they had places for them around the temple for them to live. So she probably was one of these who had no family, had no support whatsoever, and was literally dependent upon what the temple provided for her survival. And that is why the irony of her gift of the 2 coins does not escape the attention of Jesus. She who is receiving support and sustenance from the temple gives back what she can. And Christ recognizes immediately the sacrificial nature of her gift. He recognizes that he's seen something amazing, something sacred, and something similar to what he is about to do. Jesus was always seeing those things that religion never takes notice of. You remember the story that Jesus told of the prayer of the Pharisee and the tax collector, where the Pharisee was standing up in the center of the synagogue or the temple praying, "Thank you, God, for making me who I am." And way back in the corner was the tax collector, humble, his head bent, saying, "Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner." Again, Jesus in that story holding up the one who had humbled themselves before God. And then what about the story of the loaves and the fishes, where Jesus took the tiniest of meals brought by a little boy, loaves and fishes, and through the love of God, through the power of God, created enough to feed everybody that was there, the thousands that were there, starting with that humblest of meals. That's the meal that was brought to him, and that's what he used. So Jesus is so impressed by the widow's offering that he calls the disciples over to him. "Come over here. I want you to see this." And he points to her. It says, "Look at her. Notice what she's doing. Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Now, to understand the story, we have to, the way Jesus presents it to us, we have to understand that he is not talking about any kind of moral difference between rich people and poor people. It's not what he's talking about. He's talking about how faith is a quality not of power, but dependency. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes faith is introduced as something we can earn, or somehow we can do enough to receive what we need. This is what I was talking about when this particular passage is misused in certain segments of the church. When someone says, well, if you just had enough faith, you would get what you're praying for. And so they usually translate the act of faith into, so just give me all this money and you'll get what you need. And you don't have to look hard to see that message. It's all over religion and it's all over Christianity, sadly. Sometimes it takes too prominent a role, because we know that most of the church is not like that. Most of the Church of Christ is not like that. But again, we see that kind of use of faith as a power, as a way to empower someone, or as a way to have power over someone else. But Jesus here is showing us faith as one of dependency. As one of dependency. What does it mean to be dependent? We're kind of finding that out right now, aren't we? In the midst of this pestilence, in the midst of this pandemic, the things that we took for granted, we cannot take for granted anymore. And we know that in many ways, the world will never be the same again, will it? Coming out on the other side of this. I mean, maybe things will get back to normal, but we'll always have in our hearts and minds the memory of what we are going through right now. And it will change us. And the only question we have to ask ourselves is it going to change us for the better? Or will it change us for the worse? And I think the essential difference between the two is the faith in God that we have in our hearts. So many times we misunderstand faith as power. If you just had enough faith, you'd get everything you wanted. But the nature of faith is dependency upon God. It is an inner quality reflected in the way that we act and the way that we live in this world. When best-selling writer Bob Goff describes his own journey to understanding the meaning of faith, he writes these words, and I think they're very wise words. I'd invite you to listen. I learned that faith isn't about knowing all the right stuff or obeying a list of rules. It's something more costly, because it involves being present and making a sacrifice. Perhaps that's why Jesus is sometimes called Emmanuel, God with us. I think that's what God had in mind, for Jesus to be present, to just be with us. It's also what he has in mind for us when it comes to other people. Listen to that again, what Bob Goff says. Let me summarize it for you. That faith means that Jesus is present to us, always. But it also means that we who follow Christ have an obligation to be present to others. So that's really tricky right now, isn't it? To be present to others. When we are invited to kind of close off our lives wherever we are in order to stay safe. But that in itself is an act of unselfishness. Because we are helping others by not passing on, or the possibility of passing on, this virus. So sometimes even drawing inward can be an act of sharing, an act of faith, an act of being present to other people as Christ has called us to do. As Jesus pointed the disciples to understanding the widow's gift, what it was about, he was also pointing them toward the gift that he was about to give upon the cross. I mean, Jesus says that she gave all that she had. Jesus is going to give all that he has when he goes to the cross. He's going to give everything. And he's going to do so for the sake of his Father in heaven, who he loves and obeys, and for the sake of God's love for us. That's why he's doing that. So I think this is the point of the story, that Jesus is showing his disciples, you're going to see this happen again in just a few days. But it will not be the widow putting in her 2 coins. It will be me putting in everything I have upon the cross because I love you for the sake of others. Jesus is going to put in more than all, more than anyone else could ever give, for the sake of our lives and for the sake of eternal life. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean? What does the widow's story have to do with us anyway, beyond a good stewardship sermon? Well, it means something a lot more than that. John Piper answers that question quite eloquently in his book titled Desiring God. And this is what he writes. God is calling us to live for the sake of Christ, and to do that through suffering. Christ chose suffering. It didn't just happened to him. He chose it as the way to create and perfect the church. Now he calls us to choose suffering. That is, he calls us to take up our cross and follow him on the Calvary road and deny ourselves and make sacrifices for the sake of ministering to the church and presenting Christ's sufferings to the world. That's what it means to take up our cross and follow him to Calvary. And that's what we've been doing as we journey through Lent, as we share these messages together and these thoughts together. We are taking up our cross and following him in acknowledgement that there is one step further we can never go. We can go up to the cross and we can lift our eyes to it in amazement, but we can never get on it because it's not our cross, it's Christ's cross. Only he could do that. Only he could give more than anyone else for the sake of others. Just like the widow gave everything she had by putting those 2 copper pennies into that receptacle. No matter the contours of this life or of this world, are we willing to make the widow's gift to those around us? And I'm not talking about money here. Are we willing to give our comfort, our help? Are we willing to hold faith and have courage in the most difficult of times, as we're experiencing right now? It is not a gift of wealth that Christ calls us to bring to the treasury of God's love. It is a gift of our love, a sacrificial love that requires of us more than anything else that we have. It is a difficult time. But now is the time when we go forth and show our faith and show the world what it means that we are Christians. We continue to feed the hungry. We continue to care for each other, even physically separated from each other. We continue to pray, and wherever we can, we give, because that's what Christ has called us to do. So do not give up heart. Have faith. Trust. Believe. The Lord is always with us. Always has been and always will be. And we know that because he gave to us more than all. He gave us everything. A gift of love that we may have love to give. Amen.